Our personal relationships have the power to either help along this healing journey or reinforce a lot of the negative things we believe about who we are. Sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference. And how do you know when it's time to let a relationship go? Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. So this video, this episode is because back a little while ago, I did a video on how and why we can't heal on our own. And somebody shared that she has a friendship with another trauma survivor where there can sometimes be some difficulty, but then they choose to come back together and resolve it. And I think that this is a really common thing for people, whether you are two trauma survivors coming together or friends coming together, or even in like a romantic partnership, because everybody has issues. We all struggle with something. Most people are unaware of the degree to which they struggle, what that struggle actually looks like when it expresses itself, and especially why we struggle. So no matter who you are, whether you have a trauma history or not, when two people come together, each person is going to struggle in the ways that they tend to struggle. And the interactions with the other person are going to create some challenges for the other person at times. Doesn't mean that that other person has to be doing something wrong. It's just how we internalize things, how we respond when something feels uncomfortable. And I've talked about that in different ways at different times, how because of our own beliefs about ourselves and our fears, how that can cause us to react to things, how it can cause us to internalize and personalize things. So we're doing that all the time, every day. We can do it with a stranger and how they look or act towards us. We certainly do it in partnerships with people. We do it with friends. We can do it with parents and family members or even children. We are constantly taking in cues from nonverbal and verbal communication through the lens of what we believe and through the experience of our fears. So it is natural at times that things will come up within the context of a relationship that can be challenging to work through. Now, when both people are willing to acknowledge what those challenges are and to do the work to resolve that, to come together and resolve that, that can be incredibly healing and actually is an important part of this healing process. However, what often tends to happen, because again, a lot of people aren't aware of what their issues are. They don't really recognize how those are showing up and the impact that it might have on somebody else. And that's really not through our own fault. It's not that we're bad people or doing something wrong. It's just that we're not taught about any of it at all. In fact, anytime we do tend to struggle with something or acknowledge that we're struggling with something, whether it's people close to us or society at large, is telling us to just pick ourselves up and get over it, to not dwell on things and just move forward, stop thinking about it. So this isn't about somebody doing something wrong or being bad or being weak or anything like that. So when something happens within that relationship, each person is going to respond to that in the way that they tend to respond. They're going to internalize it, personalize it, catastrophize it, whatever they tend to do. They're going to do that in the way that they typically have done that, because those are very kind of ingrained ways of interpreting our experiences, feelings, and ideas. Whether we personalize, catastrophize, think of things in very black and white ways. We should do something, how we judge ourselves and therefore others. There's a lot that goes into that. So when the two people are not necessarily aware of that, people can get angry, people can feel hurt. And we're not taught really how to resolve things, generally speaking. And so what tends to happen is at least one of those people is likely going to want to just kind of push it to the side, forget about it, maybe even say, I forgive, and move on. If both people do that, things can be okay for a while. But there's going to be resentment that begins to build up for one, maybe both people. And that's why so often, even in a friendship, but also certainly in a partnership, in a family relationship, people will argue about something sometimes years later, and that thing will come back. Well, that one time you did this or something like that. I'm guilty of that. I have absolutely done that in my life. And that's because we haven't really moved on from it, because we haven't really been able to process, to understand even, and certainly to process what that experience meant to us. So one kind of much talked about example might be if a partner leaves a mess. And it could be either partner, but a partner leaves a mess and the other person has said to them, I really wish you would pick up after yourself or something like that. And they continue to leave the mess. Well, naturally, the other person is going to feel like the person that leaves the mess doesn't respect them, doesn't value them, doesn't care how they feel. That's a natural response to that. But in all reality, it doesn't have to mean that at all. There could be a lot of reasons that person continues to leave a mess. Now, I'm not excusing it or anything, but there could be a lot of reasons that person is doing that aren't really about not respecting the other person. It feels disrespectful. It's a valid feeling, but there can be some different things going on there. But because each person is likely unaware of the deeper stuff that's going on, they're certainly likely unaware of how to really communicate that. It leaves the person who feels disrespected feeling disrespected, devalued, frustrated, angry, hurt. And for the person who leaves a mess and this person gets angry at them, it leaves them feeling all kinds of things, probably a lot of the same things in many ways. Now, of course, there's a lot of nuance here, but that's just kind of an example how that can happen. And over time, the resentment builds, the sense of not being respected, not being valued, not being able to do anything right. All of that can come into play. In a friendship, so for example, when a couple of people come together, let's say you have a friend that has been through some stuff too. You're both obviously going to have your own struggles and triggers, things that when they happen, you feel an immediate reaction to it. You feel this intensity of feeling in your body. You immediately internalize and interpret what's happened. You might not be consciously aware that you're internalizing and interpreting. And when you're not aware, it has even more impact. Even if you do have an awareness of something that's happening, you're still going to feel all those feelings. You're still going to likely think all those things. Coming back down from that, you might have a little bit more ability to do that, but you might have already reacted. And if you've already reacted, even if that means pulling back, that's going to leave the other person feeling something, internalizing something. And they may not have the same ability, or it may take them a little bit longer, or maybe their way of trying to resolve it is to immediately try to work through it. But for you, you're still in that heightened state, so you're not in a place where you can do that yet. So that can certainly create similar types of problems as the other example I just gave. Obviously, it's going to look a little different, but what we're left with ultimately can be very similar. So over time, that's going to create deeper and deeper problems within that relationship. Your level of safety, your level of feeling valued, respected, your sense of enjoyment within the relationship is going to have some issues. And you might tell yourself, well, it's not a big deal, they didn't mean it. But if you're not able to really work through that, it's going to continue to impact you. Because one of the things that we tend to do is we want to forgive very quickly. We don't want to continue to feel what we're feeling. And so we say, okay, I'm moving on from that. But you haven't really moved on from it. If you find yourself continuing to think about things, playing things out in your mind in the days, weeks, certainly beyond that, about something that happened, you obviously haven't moved on from it. There's something about it, and it may not have anything to do with that particular person, but of course it's connected to that person now. But there's something about it that is creating difficulty for you. And if you continue to think about it, it's going to create difficulty within those relationships. So in terms of it being potentially healing, again, if two people are aware of what's going on, if they're willing to try to figure it out, if they're willing to accept responsibility, if they've done something that has been hurtful without blaming the other person, there is so much healing that happens in that. Truly, so much healing, and important healing. And it is important for us to be able to experience that outside of a therapeutic relationship. However, it can take sometimes a long time before we're able to really experience that outside of the therapeutic relationship, because there's a lot of healing that needs to happen so that we're not reactive, so that we have a lot of self-awareness, so that we can begin to set boundaries and have really difficult conversations. But that does become something that is really important in this process. So where it becomes a situation where it just reinforces all the negative things that we believe about who we are and what's possible for our lives, this is where we don't have that level of awareness. We tell ourselves, well, I've forgiven and I've just moved on, but we really haven't. It's going to reinforce your sense of shame. It's going to reinforce ideas that healthy relationships don't exist or are not possible for you. Likely going to reinforce that you can't really count on anybody or trust anybody. That they're not worth it, that the relationships just aren't worth it because you keep ending up hurt or alone anyway. So when things like that are reinforced, it creates this sense of hopelessness, of frustration, of the idea that it's better to be on your own, that you really can't rely on other people. And sometimes that can happen after one incident, depending on how you're able to really process what has happened and understand what it ultimately leaves you with. It can create problems within the relationship because even if you are aware and you try to work on it, you try to have those difficult conversations, the other person may not be on the same page. They may not have the ability yet to have that level of awareness and practice in having difficult conversations without feeling attacked or without their nervous system being triggered into fight, flight, or freeze, or even fawn, right? And that's where some of that people pleasing can come in, like, well, I forgive you and it's okay and, whatever. So that obviously is not a healthy situation. Doesn't mean the relationship can't evolve and be a healthy relationship eventually. But if that pattern is continuing, that's not a healthy situation for you. And so often relationships don't work out, friendships or partnerships, and certainly family relationships, because again, everybody is wounded. And when we come into a relationship with those wounds and the ways that we've coped, and the fears that we have, it makes it really, really difficult for both people at the same time to be able to be in the same place to work through those things, to have those more challenging kinds of conversations. Because it is important in a healthy relationship to be able to say to somebody, that hurt my feelings. Or when you leave your stuff laying around and you know that it really bothers me, I feel like you don't respect me. It's important to be able to say that. It's also important to be able to hear then what the other person thinks and feels. And again, assuming that they would do that in a healthy way, it can still be hard to hear. There's some healing that typically needs to happen before we can be in that place without immediately being activated in some way. And again, that activation could be anger, you yell or you blame or whatever, or it could be withdrawal. You want to be alone, you don't want to engage. It could be people pleasing, where you immediately jump in and say, oh, it's okay, I know you didn't mean it, and you just try to pretend that everything's fine. That's not a healthy situation either. The healthier you are, the easier it becomes to navigate any of those situations. Because it's easier for you to set boundaries. It's easier for you to have those difficult conversations. It's easier for you to be in the situation without that intensity of feeling coming up. And when all of that is present, when all of that is a little bit easier, you're not taking things personally. You're not catastrophizing things. You're not likely reacting from a place that is kind of like that triggered place. So, how do you then kind of navigate personal relationships? Because again, everybody's wounded and everybody's bringing their stuff into those relationships. I think one of the most important things for you is to recognize, work toward, and this is part of the practice, is working to honor the things that come up for you within the context of that relationship. So don't push it aside. Don't placate to yourself or somebody else. Don't tell yourself it's not a big deal if it feels like a big deal. And I think you probably have a sense of what I mean here, right? Like you can, on one hand, recognize that, okay, I think I'm overreacting a little bit here. That can be important to recognize from a very kind of objective place. Because sometimes people will say, oh, I'm overreacting, when in reality they're underreacting. That's part of how we cope. But if you can objectively say, okay, wait a second, I think I'm overreacting here. What is going on here? So instead of judging yourself, shaming yourself because you've overreacted, being able to give yourself some time and space and understand, like, okay, what was going on here? Why did I feel so much about that? So meeting that from a place of compassion and understanding. If you're able to do that, then you can come back into that situation and have a more grounded conversation. And assuming there's some relative health from the other person, if we're able to approach a conversation from a relatively grounded place, it's going to make it much easier and even safer to have those conversations. But if the other person cannot meet you there for whatever reason, they haven't done enough healing, they're not willing, whatever it might be, if the other person is not willing or able to meet you there, you do end up ultimately having to make a decision. And depending on that relationship, the length of time you've had the relationship, the totality of the relationship, when you look at it historically, There may be some relationships that you decide that there's only so much you can do, and you need to create some boundaries around that. And maybe it means no longer being in the relationship. Maybe it means limiting the frequency of the relationship, like how often you connect with one another. Maybe it means having more of a kind of surface type of relationship where you don't have deeper conversations, or you don't spend a lot of time together at one time. And there are certainly valuable relationships we can have that can look like that. But it's important for you to be able to recognize, what do you need that to look like? And if you're in a place where you can have a conversation with somebody and say, I really value our relationship, I really care about you, or I really love you, or whatever, but the way that we have been having these disagreements, or the level of conflict that we have, or whatever it is really causing me to feel unsettled in this relationship, or really is difficult for me, however you want to say that. And so I think it's important for us to have a conversation. If you can do that, like when we talk about how do we know where we're at on this healing journey, or how do we know I've healed, being able to do that is kind of like a goal. Being able to have difficult conversations like that, because every relationship is going to take work. Every relationship is going to have moments of conflict. That does not mean that it is unhealthy or a relationship that we should not be in. What matters is, how do we navigate that? How does it look to navigate through that? That is what determines the health of a relationship. That is what helps determine whether it is a relationship that is not, I was going to say worth, but I don't think that that's the best word to use, but is a relationship that makes sense for you to continue to try to work on. And what I mean by makes sense is, because this is hard, like to know when to give up on a relationship. Are there enough examples within this relationship that point to this person also valuing the relationship to the same degree that you do? And you can kind of discern that by, are they willing to have conversations? Are they willing to work on things? Are they willing to accept responsibility if they've let you down in some way, like not, showing up when they were supposed to show up, or whatever it might be? They've told somebody something that they weren't supposed to say. Are they able to accept responsibility? Are they able to apologize without blaming it on somebody else? Those things can help you discern whether this person is willing to meet you. It's important to recognize that how they're going to meet you, what that's going to look like, might be different than what that looks like for you. It doesn't make one person right or wrong, but you do need to feel within yourself that the way that they're doing that feels like it's enough for you. You don't want to keep making excuses for somebody. And sometimes discerning, are you making an excuse or are you willing to work on it, can also be challenging. And that's when it's important to look at the totality of the experience. So I hope that makes sense. And every relationship is so different. Every person is so different. How we show up in given moments can be quite different. So there's so much that plays into it that it's really impossible to really give specific kind of absolutes, I guess, about whether it's good or bad. I will say, if there's abuse happening, if you're being called names, that's not okay. that person, the person calling names under any circumstance, obviously has a lot that they need to work on. If they're willing to work on it, then there's some work for you to do to determine how you might be able to navigate that, if that is in fact a healthy thing for you to do. But for the most part, there's a lot that there's no kind of absolute about, which is why it's fairly challenging. So I hope that this does give you kind of something to think about as you're thinking about your relationships without feeling too overwhelmed. Keep in mind too that it's fairly rare that there's ever going to be a time, again, unless there's abuse happening and you're in a situation that there's risk of severe damage that can happen. Much of the time, you don't need to make a decision in that specific moment. It's okay to walk away, give yourself a little bit of time, generally speaking. And I do think, especially if you're working with somebody, being able to talk through all of that comes up for you can be really important and helpful. Being able to talk through that with your therapist, that by itself can be a healing process. Understanding yourself and how you're feeling and how you respond in situations, all of that can be a really important part. So it's a lot to take in. I'd love to hear from you. What came up for you? Were you able to relate to some of the things I was saying? Did you find yourself kind of replaying different experiences in your relationships? Share in the comments. If you found this helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to do so and click the bell for notifications. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.